Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the Christmas Pudding Murder. Welcome to Mindful Musings, where we find clarity and mystery and wisdom in the most unexpected places. I'm your host, William, and today we're stepping into the tranquil, yet decidedly dangerous world of Miss Jane Marple. Before we begin our journey through this Christmas mystery, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Are you curled up by a fireplace, perhaps, or enjoying a quiet moment in your own village? Do leave a comment and let me know. Now then, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Season of Tradition. The village of St. Mary Mead approached Christmas with the same methodical enthusiasm it brought to all its seasonal celebrations. Decorations appeared on shop windows precisely 2 weeks before the holiday, carol singing commenced on the first Sunday of Advent, and the annual Christmas pudding competition was held without fail on December the 20th, exactly 1 month after the puddings were prepared. Miss Jane Marple had lived through 63 such competitions, though she herself had never entered. She preferred to observe rather than compete, finding that one learned far more about human nature from watching others strive for recognition than from seeking it oneself. This year's competition promised to be particularly interesting. 15 entries had been registered, the most in a decade. The participants represented a cross-section of village life, shopkeepers and doctors, widows and young mothers, each convinced that their particular variation on the traditional recipe would prove superior. The rules had been established generations ago and remained unchanged. All puddings must be prepared on November 20th in the communal kitchen of the village hall. This requirement ensured fairness, as it prevented anyone from using professional equipment that might provide an unfair advantage. The ingredients could be brought from home, but the actual mixing, preparation, and initial steaming must occur in the hall's kitchen, supervised by the competition organizer. Once prepared, the puddings were stored in the hall's locked pantry, where they aged for precisely 1 month. On December 20th, they would be steamed again, plated with their accompaniments, and presented to the judging panel. Miss Marple had attended the preparation day this year, as she often did. She found it fascinating to observe the various approaches to what was essentially the same recipe. Some people added extra brandy, others swore by particular types of suet, and a few incorporated family secrets that they guarded zealously. Dorothy Mills, the competition organizer, had overseen the proceedings with her characteristic efficiency, a spinster of 55 with iron-grey hair and a permanent expression of mild disapproval. Dorothy treated the competition as though it were a matter of national importance. She checked each pudding into the pantry herself, recording the entry number, the creator's name, and the time of storage in her leather-bound ledger. Among this year's entries was one from Dr. Sarah Hayes, the village's general practitioner. Dr. Hayes was a woman of 40, competent and well-respected, though somewhat distant in her manner. She had taken over the practice from old Dr. Haydock 5 years earlier, and had quickly established herself as thorough, if not particularly warm. Miss Marple had noticed Dr. Hayes's pudding with interest. The doctor had been unusually focused during the preparation, measuring each ingredient with almost clinical precision. When Dorothy Mills asked about her recipe, Dr. Hayes had smiled tightly and said it was her grandmother's, unchanged for 3 generations. The judging panel this year consisted of 3 individuals. The head judge was Patricia Hammond, a food critic whose reviews in national publications could make or break restaurants. She was a woman of 60, expensively dressed and with the sort of polished appearance that suggested considerable attention to personal presentation. Her reputation for savage honesty had made her both feared and respected in culinary circles. The second judge was Marcus Webb, owner of the Three Crowns restaurant in the neighbouring town of Much Benham. He was a florid man in his 50s, whose establishment had earned considerable acclaim in recent years. He seemed nervous about judging alongside Patricia Hammond, which Miss Marple found revealing. The third judge was to have been the head of the culinary program at the regional college, but she had fallen ill, and her replacement was the college's assistant director, a young man whose name Miss Marple hadn't caught. As December 20th approached, the village hummed with anticipation. The Christmas pudding competition was more than a culinary contest. It was a social event that brought the community together, a tradition that connected past and present, a celebration of shared heritage and friendly rivalry. Miss Marple, preparing her own simple lunch on the morning of December 19th, reflected that such traditions served an important purpose in village life. They provided structure and continuity, opportunities for both competition and cooperation, occasions for displaying skill while strengthening community bonds. She had no premonition that this year's competition would end not in celebration, but in death, that the symbols of Christmas abundance and cheer would become vehicles for murder, that the communal kitchen where neighbours had worked side by side would be revealed as the site where poison had been carefully, methodically distributed. Human nature, Miss Marple had long observed, could turn even the most innocent traditions to dark purposes. Chapter 2. The Day of Judgment. December the 20th dawned cold and clear, the sort of crisp winter morning that made St. Mary Mead look like an illustration from a Christmas card. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after a simple breakfast of tea and toast, decided to walk to the village hall to observe the final preparations. The hall's kitchen was already bustling with activity when she arrived at 9:30. Dorothy Mills stood at the centre of the chaos, clipboard in hand, directing the reheating of the puddings with military precision. The 15 entries, each wrapped in muslin and labelled with its number, sat in large steamers on the stove. The accompaniments, brandy butter, cream and custard, were being prepared fresh that morning, as per tradition. Each competitor was responsible for bringing their chosen accompaniment, which would be stored in the communal refrigerator until serving time. Miss Marple noticed Dr. Sarah Hayes arrive at precisely 10 o'clock, carrying a small insulated bag. The doctor nodded politely to Dorothy Mills and proceeded to the refrigerator, where she placed a labelled container of what Miss Marple presumed was brandy butter. Dr. Hayes appeared calm, though perhaps slightly more tense than usual, but that was hardly surprising given the competitive nature of the event. Marcus Webb arrived shortly afterward, flustered and apologetic about his lateness. He'd brought a container of rum sauce, explaining that he felt brandy butter was becoming rather passé. Dorothy Mills frowned at this innovation but allowed it, as the rules didn't specifically require brandy butter. Patricia Hammond swept in at 11, her entrance commanding immediate attention. She wore a burgundy wool suit that probably cost more than most of the competitors spent on groceries in a month. Her critical eye swept over the kitchen, and Miss Marple saw several people instinctively straighten under that gaze. The hall caretaker, Thomas Reed, was present throughout the morning, ostensibly to ensure the facilities were functioning properly. He was a quiet man of about 45, widowed young and devoted to maintaining the hall with almost obsessive care. Miss Marple had observed him checking and rechecking the refrigerator temperature, adjusting the steamers, and generally hovering in a way that suggested considerable anxiety. The judging was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock. The village hall's main room had been arranged with a long table for the judges and 15 smaller tables where each pudding would be displayed. Curious villagers began gathering from 1:30, filling the folding chairs arranged theatre-style to observe the proceedings. Miss Marple took a seat in the third row, positioning herself where she could observe both the judges' table and the competitors. She had brought her knitting, a baby's bonnet in soft yellow wool, which allowed her to watch without appearing to stare. At precisely 2 o'clock, Dorothy Mills called for silence. She explained the judging procedure with the thoroughness of someone who had delivered the same speech for 20 years. Each pudding would be plated with its accompaniment, then presented to the judges. Patricia Hammond, as head judge, would taste first, followed by Marcus Webb and the college representative, a nervous young man named Timothy Fletcher. To ensure fairness, Patricia would draw numbers randomly rather than tasting in sequential order. Dorothy held up a small cloth bag containing 15 numbered tokens. Patricia drew the first token with a flourish. Number 8. Dorothy consulted her ledger. Entry number 8, Dr. Sarah Hayes. A ripple of interest passed through the audience. Dr. Hayes stepped forward to collect her pudding from the warming area. Her face was composed, professional, betraying nothing. The pudding was plated beautifully, the dark richness of the steamed fruit contrasting with the pale cream of the brandy butter that Dr. Hayes spooned alongside it. She carried the plate to the judge's table and set it before Patricia Hammond. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she watched Patricia lift her fork. The food critic examined the pudding critically, noting its texture and appearance. She made a notation on her score sheet, then cut a small portion, ensuring she captured both pudding and brandy butter on her fork. The room was silent as Patricia placed the forkful in her mouth. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression neutral. Then she reached for the brandy butter, taking a more generous portion directly on her fork. What happened next occurred with terrible swiftness. Patricia's hand, reaching for her water glass, began to tremble. Her face, already pale with powder, went chalk white. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. Marcus Webb half rose from his seat. "Patricia, are you quite all right?" Patricia Hammond pitched forward onto the table, scattering score sheets and overturning her water glass. Someone screamed. Several people rushed forward. Miss Marple remained seated, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene, even as her heart filled with the familiar sadness that always accompanied such moments. Dr. Sarah Hayes reached the judges' table first, her medical training overriding any competitive concerns. She checked Patricia's pulse, her face growing grim. She looked up at Dorothy Mills. "Call an ambulance immediately." But Miss Marple, watching the doctor's face, knew what the doctor herself must already know. No ambulance would save Patricia Hammond. The food critic was dead. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The village hall erupted into chaos. Dorothy Mills, normally so composed, stood frozen with her clipboard clutched to her chest. Marcus Webb backed away from the judge's table, his face ashen. Timothy Fletcher, the young judge, appeared close to fainting. Dr. Hayes continued her examination of Patricia Hammond with professional detachment, but Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in the doctor's hands as she confirmed what everyone already suspected. "She's gone," Dr. Hayes announced quietly. "I'm very sorry." Several women in the audience began weeping. Thomas Reed, the caretaker, hurried to open windows despite the December cold, as though fresh air might somehow reverse what had happened. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting still in her lap, her mind already beginning to organize the observations she'd made. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, though there was nothing to be done. The paramedics confirmed Dr. Hayes' assessment and notified the police. Inspector Slack arrived 40 minutes later, accompanied by Constable Lake. Inspector Slack was a man of 50, stocky and red-faced, with a manner that suggested he found most people irritating, and witnesses particularly so. Miss Marple had encountered him during several previous investigations, and knew he regarded her interest in crime as meddlesome, though he'd grudgingly admitted on more than one occasion that her observations had proved useful. "Nobody leaves," Inspector Slack announced, surveying the gathered crowd. "I'll need statements from everyone present, particularly those who were in the kitchen this morning." The inspector established himself at a small table in the corner of the hall and began methodically interviewing people. Miss Marple continued her knitting, appearing to pay no attention while actually listening carefully to every conversation within earshot. Dr. Hayes was interviewed first. Her statement was clear and precise. She'd prepared her Christmas pudding according to her grandmother's recipe on November 20th, exactly as required. The pudding had been stored in the locked pantry for 1 month. She'd prepared the brandy butter fresh that morning in her surgery kitchen, using butter, icing sugar, and brandy from her personal supplies. The brandy butter had been kept in her surgery refrigerator until she brought it to the village hall at 10 o'clock. "And you placed it in the communal refrigerator yourself?" Inspector Slack asked. "Yes, in a labelled container. Entry number 8, my name clearly written on the lid. Did you notice anyone else near the refrigerator?" Dr. Hayes frowned, thinking. "Mr. Webb arrived shortly after me. He was also putting something in the refrigerator. And Mr. Reed was adjusting the temperature control. He seemed concerned it wasn't cold enough. Did you return to the kitchen at any point before the judging?" "Only once around noon to check that my container was still properly sealed. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it." Inspector Slack made notes, his expression skeptical. "You're aware, Dr. Hayes, that you had access to various substances that might prove poisonous?" The doctor's face tightened. "I'm a physician, Inspector. My entire profession is built on the principle of doing no harm. I certainly didn't poison my own pudding's accompaniment." "We'll see," Inspector Slack muttered, dismissing her. Miss Marple watched Dr. Hayes return to her seat among the other competitors. The doctor's hands were trembling slightly now, the professional composure beginning to crack. Guilt, Miss Marple wondered, or simply the natural reaction to being suspected of murder. Dorothy Mills was interviewed next. She provided a detailed account of the morning's activities, consulting her ledger frequently. Every pudding had been accounted for, every accompaniment properly labelled and stored. She'd been in and out of the kitchen throughout the morning, supervising the reheating process and ensuring everything proceeded according to schedule. The kitchen was quite busy, she admitted. Dr. Hayes, Mr. Webb, Miss Hammond herself, Mr. Reed and myself, all moving about, preparing things, checking on the puddings. The refrigerator was opened frequently. "Did you notice anyone behaving suspiciously?" Inspector Slack asked. Dorothy Mills pursed her lips. "Well, I wouldn't say suspiciously, exactly. But Mr. Reed did seem unusually anxious. He kept checking the refrigerator temperature, as I mentioned. And Miss Hammond was rather imperious, sampling things from various containers. I had to remind her that the tasting should wait for the official judging. Miss Hammond sampled the accompaniments beforehand." Inspector Slack's interest sharpened. "Just small tastes," Dorothy said. She claimed she needed to ensure proper quality control, though I thought it rather presumptuous. "She specifically tried several of the brandy butter containers, I believe." "Which ones?" Dorothy consulted her ledger, then shook her head. "I'm not certain. She was moving quite quickly, and I was attending to the puddings, perhaps 3 or 4 containers. She seemed particularly interested in comparing the different recipes." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Did she try entry number 8's brandy butter?" Dorothy Mills frowned, thinking hard. "I honestly cannot say, Inspector. It all happened rather quickly, and I was distracted by the steamers." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. This was interesting information indeed. If Patricia Hammond had sampled multiple brandy butter containers before the official judging, why had she only shown symptoms after tasting entry number 8? Either the other containers she'd sampled were not poisoned, or she'd consumed such small amounts that the poison hadn't yet taken effect. Or, Miss Marple thought, there was something else entirely at work. Chapter 4. Secrets and Motives. By early evening, Inspector Slack had interviewed everyone present at the village hall. The pudding competition attendees had been allowed to leave, though with stern warnings not to discuss the case. The competitors, judges, Dorothy Mills and Thomas Reed had been instructed to remain available for further questioning. Miss Marple walked home through the darkening streets, her mind busy with what she had observed. The December evening was cold, frost already forming on the bare branches, and lights glowing warmly in cottage windows. St. Mary Mead appeared as peaceful as always, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the tranquil surface currents of fear, suspicion, and perhaps guilt were flowing. She had hardly settled in her cottage when her telephone rang. It was her nephew Raymond calling from London. "Aunt Jane, I've just heard about the poisoning at your village Christmas pudding competition. It's already in the evening papers. Are you quite all right?" "Perfectly well, dear," Miss Marple assured him, "though I'm afraid poor Patricia Hammond was not so fortunate." "Patricia Hammond," Raymond repeated thoughtfully. "The food critic?" "Good Lord, Aunt Jane, she was notorious. Absolutely ruthless in her reviews. She destroyed more careers than I can count." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "I had gathered she was not universally beloved." "Not beloved?" Raymond gave a short laugh. "She was universally loathed, more like. I'm a publisher, as you know, and even I've heard stories. She accepted bribes from restaurants for favourable reviews, blackmailed chefs over hygiene violations. She single-handedly ruined several establishments that probably deserved better." Miss Marple made an interested sound. "How very unpleasant. There was a case about 20 years ago," Raymond continued, warming to his subject. "A small tea room somewhere in your part of the country, actually. The owner was an older woman, a widow trying to make a living. Hammond wrote a devastating review, completely unfounded according to people who knew the place. The tea room went bankrupt and the owner died of a heart attack shortly after. There was talk of a lawsuit, but nothing came of it." "Do you recall the name of the tea room?" Miss Marple asked. "Let me think. Something floral. Rose Cottage Tea Room? No. Wait. The Primrose Tea Room. That was it. Why do you ask?" "Just curious, dear," Miss Marple said. "Thank you for calling. You've been most informative." After she rang off, Miss Marple sat by her fire for a long moment, thinking. The Primrose Tea Room. The name was familiar, and if her memory served her correctly, the woman who had owned it had been named Margaret Hayes. She had died 20 years ago, when her daughter Sarah would have been about 20, Dr. Sarah Hayes's mother. The next morning brought fresh snow and fresh information. Inspector Slack, looking haggard from lack of sleep, convened another round of interviews at the village hall. Miss Marple, uninvited but undeterred, arrived at 9:30 with a basket of fresh scones and the reasonable excuse that she'd promised Dorothy Mills some baking for the hall's Christmas tea. Inspector Slack eyed her suspiciously but accepted a scone. "The autopsy results are back," he announced to the small group assembled in the hall's meeting room. Patricia Hammond died of cyanide poisoning. The poison was in the brandy butter served with entry number 8, Dr. Hayes's pudding. Specifically, it was mixed into the brandy butter itself, not added afterward. Dr. Hayes sat very still, her face pale but composed. Sodium cyanide, to be precise, the inspector continued, a substance that, interestingly, Dr. Hayes had purchased 3 months ago for what she claimed was medical equipment sterilization. "I did purchase it," Dr. Hayes said evenly. "It's used in certain sterilization processes for surgical instruments. The purchase was entirely legitimate and properly recorded. And yet," Inspector Slack said, "here we have Patricia Hammond, dead from sodium cyanide poisoning after eating brandy butter that you prepared." "That I prepared," Dr. Hayes agreed, "but that was sitting in a communal refrigerator, accessible to anyone who entered the kitchen, for 4 hours before the judging." Miss Marple raised her hand slightly as though she were in school. "Excuse me, Inspector, but I wonder if you've had a chance to test the other brandy butter containers." Inspector Slack frowned. "The other containers?" "Yes. There were 15 puddings, and I believe at least 10 of them used brandy butter as an accompaniment. Have those been tested for poison?" The inspector looked annoyed at not having thought of this himself. "We'll do so immediately." By noon, the results were available. Inspector Slack's face was grim as he addressed the group once more. "Every single brandy butter container in that refrigerator contained sodium cyanide," he announced. "All 15 of them, not just entry number 8. Chapter 5. The Pattern Revealed. The revelation that all 15 brandy butter containers had been poisoned sent shock waves through the investigation. Inspector Slack immediately ordered the village hall's kitchen sealed as a crime scene, and Constable Lake began the laborious process of documenting every detail. Miss Marple, still present with her basket of scones, sat quietly in a corner of the meeting room, her knitting needles working steadily while her mind worked faster still. The picture was becoming clearer, though the full pattern had not yet revealed itself. Inspector Slack was interrogating Dorothy Mills with renewed vigour. "Walk me through this again. Every single person who had access to that kitchen this morning." Dorothy consulted her omnipresent ledger. "From 8 o'clock when I opened the hall until 2 o'clock when the judging began, the following people entered the kitchen at various times. Myself, obviously. Dr. Sarah Hayes, Mr. Marcus Webb, Miss Patricia Hammond, Mr. Thomas Reed, and briefly Timothy Fletcher, though he only poked his head in to ask when judging would start. And the refrigerator was unlocked throughout this time. Of course, it needed to be accessed repeatedly as people brought their accompaniments. Could someone have poisoned all 15 containers without being observed? Dorothy considered this carefully. The kitchen was often empty for periods of 10 or 15 minutes when I was in the main hall arranging chairs, or when others were occupied elsewhere. Yes, I suppose someone could have done so, if they were quick about it. Inspector Slack turned to Dr. Hayes. "You had the means and the knowledge to acquire and use cyanide. You had access to the kitchen. And," he paused significantly, "I've learned that Patricia Hammond ruined your mother's tea room 20 years ago with a false review. Your mother died shortly after the business failed." Dr. Hayes's composed expression finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady. "Yes, Patricia Hammond destroyed my mother's livelihood and contributed to her death. I've hated that woman for 20 years, but I did not poison those brandy butter containers." "Then who did?" Inspector Slack demanded. Before Dr. Hayes could respond, Miss Marple's quiet voice interrupted. "Perhaps the question is not who poisoned the containers, but why all of them were poisoned." Inspector Slack turned to her, irritated. "What are you going on about now, Miss Marple?" "Well," Miss Marple said mildly, her needles never pausing, "consider the logistics. Patricia Hammond was to taste the puddings in random order, drawing numbers from a bag. The killer could not predict which pudding she would taste first. If only one container had been poisoned, and it happened to be entry number 15 while Patricia started with entry number 1, the plan would have failed entirely. The The inspector's expression shifted from irritation to interest. "Go on." "By poisoning all 15 containers," Miss Marple continued, "the killer ensured that Patricia would die regardless of which pudding she tasted first. It was not a targeted poisoning of one specific entry. It was a comprehensive poisoning of every possible option." "But that's," Inspector Slack struggled for words, "monstrous. Any of the other judges could have died." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed sadly, "which tells us something quite important about our killer. This was someone so consumed with the need for revenge that they were willing to risk multiple deaths to ensure their primary target did not escape." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this. Marcus Webb spoke for the first time, his voice shaking. "Are you saying that Timothy and I could have died as well, if we'd tasted our portions before Patricia's symptoms appeared?" "That's exactly what she's saying," Inspector Slack confirmed, looking at Miss Marple with new respect. "This wasn't just murder. It was potential mass murder." Dr. Hayes stood abruptly. "I need some air. This is unbearable." "Sit down, Doctor," Inspector Slack commanded. "We're not finished." But Miss Marple's gentle voice intervened again. "Perhaps Dr. Hayes might step outside for a moment, Inspector. With a constable accompanying her, of course. She does look quite unwell." Inspector Slack hesitated, then nodded to Constable Lake, who escorted the trembling doctor outside. Once they'd gone, Miss Marple addressed the inspector quietly. "You should examine Dr. Hayes' surgery very carefully, Inspector, particularly her refrigerator and her supplies of sodium cyanide. I think you'll find something revealing." That afternoon, Inspector Slack and Constable Lake searched Dr. Hayes' surgery with her reluctant permission. They found exactly what Miss Marple had suggested they would: a container of sodium cyanide in the storage cupboard, significantly depleted, a mortar and pestle in the surgery's small kitchen with traces of white powder in the base, and, most damningly, a handwritten list in Dr. Hayes' desk drawer. The list was titled Plan and detailed a methodical approach to poisoning. Purchase cyanide with legitimate medical excuse. Grind to fine powder for easy mixing. Add small amounts to all accompaniments to ensure target consumes poison regardless of tasting order. Prepare brandy butter, morning of competition, to ensure freshness masks any chemical taste. Inspector Slack returned to the village hall with the list and placed it on the table before Dr. Hayes. "Would you care to explain this, Doctor?" Dr. Hayes looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she raised her eyes to meet the inspector's gaze. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll explain everything. Chapter 6. Confession and Motive." Dr. Sarah Hayes sat in the meeting room of the village hall, surrounded by Inspector Slack, Constable Lake, Dorothy Mills, and Miss Marple. She had declined legal representation, saying she wanted to simply tell the truth and be done with it. "I've been planning this for 2 years," she began, her voice steady now that the secret was out. "Ever since I learned that Patricia Hammond was judging the Christmas pudding competition." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Why wait 2 years? If you'd wanted revenge for what she did to your mother, why not act sooner?" "Because I didn't know where she lived," Dr. Hayes said simply. "She moved around frequently, maintained a low profile outside her professional life. When Dorothy announced she'd secured Patricia Hammond as head judge, I saw my opportunity. I knew she would come here, to St. Mary Mead, to this village hall. I knew I could finally make her pay for what she did." "Tell us about your mother," Miss Marple said gently. Dr. Hayes' eyes grew distant. "My mother opened the Primrose Tea Room when I was 12 years old. After my father died, it was all we had. She poured everything into it, her savings, her energy, her heart. It was beautiful. Small, but beautifully done. The food was excellent, local, fresh, homemade." She paused, lost in memory. "Patricia Hammond came one afternoon when I was 17. I was there helping serve. I remember her examining everything with this cold, critical eye. She ordered the set tea, ate everything, seemed to enjoy it, even complimented my mother on the scones." "And then?" Inspector Slack prompted. "Then she published her review." Dr. Hayes' voice hardened. She claimed the food was substandard, the hygiene questionable, the service incompetent. She wrote that she'd seen mice in the kitchen. That was a complete lie. We never had mice. My mother was meticulous about cleanliness. What happened to the tea room? Within a month, our business had dropped by 70%. People believed the review. Why wouldn't they? Patricia Hammond was famous, respected. Who were we? Nobody. My mother tried to sue for libel, but the lawyer said it would cost more than we had, and there was no guarantee of winning. The tea room went bankrupt 6 months later. And your mother? Had a heart attack 3 weeks after we closed. The doctor said it was stress. She was only 52. Dr. Hayes's hands clenched in her lap. I watched her die, knowing that Patricia Hammond had killed her as surely as if she'd used poison. So you decided to use poison yourself, Inspector Slack said. Not immediately. For years, I focused on my medical training. I became a doctor because my mother had always wanted that for me. I built a good life, but I never forgot. And when the opportunity arose, I took it. Walk us through what you did, the inspector instructed. Dr. Hayes took a breath. 3 months ago, I ordered sodium cyanide through proper medical channels, claiming I needed it for equipment sterilization. That's a legitimate use, so no one questioned it. I stored it in my surgery. She continued. I prepared my Christmas pudding on November the 20th, exactly according to the rules. The pudding itself was never poisoned. It was my grandmother's actual recipe. I thought there was a kind of justice in that, using something my mother had loved and taught me to make. And the brandy butter. I prepared 15 containers of brandy butter on the morning of December 20th. I made a large batch, then divided it into 15 equal portions. I ground the sodium cyanide into a fine powder and mixed small amounts into each container. Not enough to be visible or to significantly alter the taste, but enough to be fatal if consumed. Why all 15? Dorothy Mills asked, her voice shocked. Why not just your own? Dr. Hayes turned to her. Because Patricia Hammond was drawing numbers randomly. I had no way of knowing which pudding she would taste first. If I poisoned only my own container, she might never taste it. She might start with entry 1 or entry 12 and my plan would fail. By poisoning all of them, I guaranteed she would die regardless of which pudding she chose. But the other judges, Miss Marple said quietly, what about them? Dr. Hayes's face showed a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps merely calculation. I knew the head judge always tasted first. It's traditional. By the time Patricia showed symptoms, the other judges would be alerted before they tasted anything. I'd also calculated that the amount in each container was sufficient to kill an adult, but would take several minutes to act. Patricia would consume the poison, show symptoms before anyone else tasted, and the judging would stop. That was a considerable risk, Inspector Slack observed. I'm aware, Dr. Hayes said, but I was willing to take it. Patricia Hammond destroyed my family. She did it casually, carelessly, without a second thought. She ruined people's lives for her own advancement. Someone had to stop her. So you appointed yourself judge and executioner, the inspector said. Yes. And you used your medical knowledge to commit murder. Yes. Do you have any remorse? Dr. Hayes considered the question carefully. For the risk I posed to the other judges, yes. That troubles me. But for Patricia Hammond's death, no. She deserved what she got. Chapter 7. The Web of Victims. After Dr. Hayes was taken into custody, Inspector Slack turned his attention to documenting the full scope of Patricia Hammond's destructive career. What emerged was a pattern of malicious behaviour spanning decades, affecting far more people than anyone had initially realised. Miss Marple, who had remained at the village hall at Inspector Slack's grudging invitation, listened as he compiled his findings. Dorothy Mills had provided information about the competition's history. Patricia Hammond had judged once before 15 years ago, Dorothy explained. She gave the winner, a young woman named Elizabeth Reed, such a savage critique that the poor girl never entered another competition. She called Elizabeth's pudding pedestrian and lacking in imagination, though it had won second place the year before with another judge. Reed? Inspector Slack repeated. Any relation to Thomas Reed, the caretaker? His wife, Dorothy said quietly. She died 10 years ago. Cancer. But Thomas always said the humiliation from Patricia Hammond's comments contributed to Elizabeth's depression. She lost all confidence in herself after that. Inspector Slack made a note to interview Thomas Reed more thoroughly. Marcus Webb's connection to Patricia Hammond proved equally damaging. Under questioning, the restaurant owner admitted that Hammond had demanded £20,000 for a favourable review of his establishment. The 3 Crowns. She came for dinner about 6 months ago, Webb explained, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She loved everything. complimented the food, the service, the ambience. Then she asked to speak to me privately. She said she was preparing a review that would appear in next month's magazine. She could make it very positive or very negative, depending on whether I valued her professional opinion. That's blackmail, Inspector Slack observed. Obviously, Webb snapped. But what was I to do? Refuse and receive a devastating review that would destroy my business? Or pay and save everything I'd worked for? I paid. Half up front, half after the positive review appeared. Did you consider reporting her? To whom? The magazine that employed her? They benefited from her reputation. The police? What proof did I have? It was her word against mine, and she was famous while I was nobody. And did you poison the brandy butter containers? Inspector Slack asked directly. Webb's eyes widened. Good God, no. I was terrified of her, Inspector. The thought of revenge never even crossed my mind. I just wanted to avoid her notice in the future. Miss Marple, observing this interview from the corner where she was ostensibly examining the hall's Christmas decorations, noted Webb's genuine shock. This was not the reaction of a murderer whose crime had been discovered. Thomas Reed's interview was more complicated. The caretaker admitted that his wife had been devastated by Patricia Hammond's criticism years ago. Elizabeth took such pride in her baking, Reed said, his voice thick with emotion. Her grandmother's recipes passed down through generations. She entered that competition with such hope. And Patricia Hammond destroyed her with words, called her pudding pedestrian, said it showed no creativity or skill. He paused, wiping his eyes. Elizabeth never baked another Christmas pudding. She said she couldn't bear to face failure again. When she got sick, I sometimes wondered if she'd given up on life because she'd already learned she wasn't good enough. Did you know Dr. Hayes planned to poison Patricia Hammond? Inspector Slack asked. Reed's head snapped up. Of course not. How would I know such a thing? You were in the kitchen all morning. You had access to the refrigerator. I was checking the temperature controls, Reed protested. The refrigerator is old and sometimes runs too warm. I wanted to ensure the food remained safe. That's my job. Inspector Slack studied him carefully. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone behaving suspiciously around the brandy butter containers? Reed frowned, thinking. Dr. Hayes was in and out several times. She seemed, I don't know, focused, intense, more than one would expect for a simple pudding competition. And Patricia Hammond herself was sampling things. Dorothy told her not to, but she did it anyway. I saw her taste at least 3 different brandy butter containers before Dorothy noticed and stopped her. Which 3? Reed shook his head. I wasn't paying close attention. I was worried about the refrigerator temperature. After Reed left, Inspector Slack sat back in his chair looking frustrated. Everyone had motive, he said. Everyone had opportunity. But only Dr. Hayes had the medical knowledge and the deliberate planning to pull this off. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the timeline more carefully. What about the timeline? Well, Miss Marple said mildly, Patricia Hammond sampled several brandy butter containers before the official judging, according to multiple witnesses. Yet she showed no symptoms until after she tasted entry number 8 during the formal judging. If all the containers were poisoned with the same concentration of cyanide as Dr. Hayes claims, why didn't Patricia show symptoms earlier? Inspector Slack frowned. Perhaps she only took very small taste before. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. Or perhaps the earlier containers she sampled were not yet poisoned, which would suggest the poison was added after Patricia's preliminary sampling, but before the official judging. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting Dr. Hayes didn't poison the containers when she claims? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that we should verify exactly when the poison was administered. The timing may be more important than we've realized. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Dorothy Mills appeared at her cottage door, looking distressed and carrying a large envelope. Miss Marple, forgive me for calling so late, but I've found something that I think you should see. Miss Marple invited her in and made tea while Dorothy explained. I was going through the competition records tonight, trying to make sense of everything. I found Patricia Hammond's judging notes from her previous visit 15 years ago. She kept copies of all her critiques in her files. And I found something else. She opened the envelope and withdrew several documents. Letters between Patricia Hammond and various people she'd reviewed over the years. Demands for payment, threats of negative reviews, evidence of systematic blackmail and corruption. "Where did you find these?" Miss Marple asked. "In Patricia's briefcase. The police gave it to me to return to her family, but when I opened it to find contact information, I discovered these papers. Miss Marple, there are at least 20 people documented here who had reason to want Patricia Hammond dead." Miss Marple examined the papers carefully. Among them was a letter from someone signing themselves concerned citizen, warning Patricia to stay away from St. Mary Mead. The handwriting was distinctive, slanted, and precise. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" Miss Marple asked Dorothy. Dorothy studied it, then gasped. "That's Thomas Reed's writing. I'm certain of it. He writes the maintenance logs for the hall in exactly that style." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I think, Dorothy, that you should give these papers to Inspector Slack first thing tomorrow morning. They may change the complexion of the entire investigation." After Dorothy left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind. Dr. Hayes had confessed, had provided detailed information about how she'd committed the murder, had shown no remorse. The case appeared solved. Yet something troubled Miss Marple, the timing, as she'd mentioned to Inspector Slack, and something else, something about Dr. Hayes' confession that struck a false note, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. She thought about the Christmas pudding tradition, about how it brought people together in shared purpose, about how the communal kitchen embodied the spirit of cooperation and community. Someone had perverted that tradition, turning it into a vehicle for death. But had that someone really been Dr. Hayes, or was there another layer to this case that had not yet been revealed? Chapter 8. Doubt and Revelation. The following morning brought another layer of frost to St. Mary Mead, and another layer of complexity to the murder investigation. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage before breakfast, looking harried and frustrated. "I've received the final analysis from the forensics laboratory," he announced without preamble. "There's something very odd about the poisoning." Miss Marple set aside her morning tea and listened attentively. "The sodium cyanide in the brandy butter containers was not uniformly mixed," the inspector explained. "In most of the containers the poison had settled somewhat, suggesting it was mixed in and then left undisturbed. But in entry number 8, Dr. Hayes's container, the poison was more thoroughly incorporated, as though it had been mixed more recently or more vigorously." "That is interesting," Miss Marple observed. "Furthermore," the inspector continued, "the concentration in entry number 8 was significantly higher than in the other containers, nearly twice the lethal dose, while the others contained amounts that would certainly kill, but more slowly." Miss Marple's needles paused. "So Patricia Hammond died quickly because entry number 8 contained a particularly high concentration of poison." "Exactly. Which means either Dr. Hayes was inconsistent in her mixing, or someone tampered with entry number 8 specifically after the initial poisoning. Or," Miss Marple said quietly, "Dr. Hayes poisoned only entry number 8, and someone else poisoned the remaining 14 containers." Inspector Slack stared at her. "But Dr. Hayes confessed to poisoning all 15. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "which is what has been troubling me. Why would she confess to more than she'd actually done?" The inspector sat down heavily. "You're suggesting her confession was false, or partially false." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that Dr. Hayes is protecting someone. Or perhaps she believes she's guilty of something she didn't actually do. Remember, she discovered all 15 containers were poisoned only after her arrest. Until that moment, she may have believed she'd poisoned only her own. But who else would have poisoned the other containers? And why?" Miss Marple reached for the documents Dorothy Mills had brought the previous evening. "I think these may provide an answer." She showed Inspector Slack the letters, particularly the warning note to Patricia Hammond signed by a concerned citizen. The inspector's expression grew grim as he examined Thomas Reed's handwriting samples from the hall's maintenance logs. "It's a match," he admitted. "Reed wrote this letter, warning Hammond to stay away." "There's something else," Miss Marple said. "I've been thinking about the timeline." Patricia Hammond arrived at 11 o'clock and immediately began sampling the brandy butter containers, according to witnesses. She sampled at least 3 before Dorothy Mills stopped her, yet she showed no symptoms until after the formal judging began at 2 o'clock, which suggests those early containers weren't poisoned yet, Inspector Slack said, following her logic. The poison was added sometime between Hammond's sampling and the official judging. Precisely. And during that period, Who had the most unfettered access to the kitchen? Thomas Reed, the inspector, said. He was supposed to be monitoring the facilities. Miss Marple nodded. I believe we should speak with Mr. Reed again, and perhaps more directly this time. Thomas Reed was brought to the village hall for questioning. This time, faced with the warning letter and the timeline analysis, his composure crumbled. I didn't know about Dr. Hayes's plan, he insisted. I swear I didn't. I had my own plan, completely separate. Explain, Inspector Slack commanded. Reed's face was anguished. When I learned Patricia Hammond was judging the competition, something inside me snapped. 15 years of anger and grief watching my Elizabeth fade away after that woman destroyed her confidence. I couldn't let Hammond just waltz in here and judge more puddings, ruin more lives. So what did you do? I ordered sodium cyanide online, claiming I needed it for pest control at the hall. I planned to poison one of the brandy butter containers, one that wasn't mine, so suspicion wouldn't fall on me. I thought if I poisoned just one, it would look like that particular competitor was guilty. But you poisoned more than one, Inspector Slack said. Reed nodded miserably. I came to the hall early on the 20th, around 7 in the morning, before Dorothy arrived. I mixed the poison into powder form, preparing it for use. But then Patricia Hammond arrived earlier than expected, at 9 instead of 11. She started sampling the brandy butter containers immediately. I panicked. I realized that if she sampled the one poisoned container before the official judging, she might show symptoms, and the plan would fail. So he struggled with the words. I poisoned all the containers I could reach. Not thoroughly, just quickly mixing poison into each one. I thought if all of them were poisoned, she'd definitely consume a lethal dose during the official judging, regardless of what she'd sampled earlier. But you didn't poison entry number 8, Miss Marple said, because Dr. Hayes hadn't brought it yet. Reed looked at her, startled. No, Dr. Hayes arrived at 10, after I'd already finished. Her container was the only one I didn't poison, which means, Inspector Slack said heavily, that Dr. Hayes poisoned only her own container, while you poisoned the other 14. Yes, Reed whispered, but I didn't know she'd also poisoned hers. I thought I was working alone. When Patricia died, I assumed my poison had killed her. I was horrified, but also grimly satisfied. Justice had been served, I thought. And when Dr. Hayes confessed, I was shocked, confused. I couldn't understand why she would confess to poisoning all 15 containers when I knew I'd poisoned 14 of them. Then I realized she must have poisoned hers, not knowing about mine. We'd independently come up with the same plan. Inspector Slack looked at Miss Marple. 2 would-be murderers, working independently, both poisoning the brandy butter. It's almost absurd. Almost, Miss Marple agreed. Except that it resulted in Patricia Hammond's death, which is anything but absurd. Reed raised his head. Will I be charged with murder? You'll certainly be charged, Inspector Slack said grimly. Whether it's murder or attempted murder depends on whose poison actually killed Hammond. Given that entry number 8 had the highest concentration and caused the fastest death, it appears Dr. Hayes's poison was the fatal dose. But you attempted to kill her as well, and you succeeded in creating a situation where multiple innocent judges could have died. I never meant for the other judges to die, Reed protested weakly. Yet, you were willing to risk it, Miss Marple said, her voice sad but firm. Just as Dr. Hayes was willing to risk it. Both of you valued revenge more than innocent lives. That's what makes this case particularly tragic. Patricia Hammond was a terrible person who harmed many people, but 2 of her victims became as morally compromised as she was in seeking vengeance. Chapter 9. The Moral Tangle. The revelation that 2 separate people had independently planned and executed poisoning attempts on the same victim created a legal and ethical quandary that occupied St. Mary Mead's attention for weeks. Inspector Slack, with assistance from investigators from Scotland Yard, worked to determine the exact legal implications. Miss Marple visited Dr. Sarah Hayes in custody 3 days after Thomas Reed's confession. The doctor looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but she greeted Miss Marple with something approaching relief. I wondered if you'd come, De Hayes said. You're the only one who seemed to understand what I'd done from the beginning. I understood your motive, Miss Marple corrected gently, but I confess I didn't initially grasp the full complexity of what had occurred. I didn't realize Mr. Reed had also acted independently. 2 poisoners, Dr. Hayes said with a bitter smile. like something from an absurd play. Tell me, Miss Marple, does that make us more guilty or less? More guilty, I'm afraid, Miss Marple replied. Each of you acted with full intent to kill. The fact that you didn't coordinate doesn't absolve either of you. No, I suppose it doesn't. Dr. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You know, I spent 20 years becoming a doctor, learning to heal, to preserve life. My mother would have been so proud. And then I spent 3 months planning to take a life. How does that happen? You allowed hatred to grow unchecked, Miss Marple said. Grief is natural when we lose someone we love. Anger at injustice is understandable. But when we nurture those feelings year after year, they transform into something destructive. You stopped seeing Patricia Hammond as a human being and saw her only as the symbol of everything that had hurt you. She was a human being who destroyed other human beings, Dr. Hayes countered. She ruined lives casually, for profit and for entertainment. Someone needed to stop her. But not through murder, Miss Marple said firmly. Not through a method that risked innocent lives. Dr. Hayes, you're an intelligent woman. You must have known that poisoning all those containers meant the other judges could have died as well. I calculated the probabilities, Dr. Hayes admitted. I thought the traditional order, head judge tasting first, would protect them. I thought Patricia would show symptoms before anyone else tasted. But you couldn't be certain, and you proceeded anyway. Yes, I proceeded anyway. Dr. Hayes met Miss Marple's gaze directly. Does that make me a monster? It makes you human, Miss Marple said. Humans are capable of terrible things when they convince themselves that vengeance is justice. The tragedy is that you had so much to offer the world. You were a skilled physician, saving lives, helping people, and you threw that away for revenge. Dr. Hayes's eyes filled with tears. I know that now. But when I was planning it, all I could think about was my mother, how she'd died because of that woman, how Patricia Hammond had never been held accountable, never even acknowledged what she'd done. It consumed me. Revenge often does, Miss Marple observed. It's like a poison itself, isn't it? It seemed to promise relief, satisfaction, justice, but it only spreads more harm. Thomas Reed said something similar during his interview, Dr. Hayes said. He talked about how planning the murder had given him purpose, but executing it had given him nothing but emptiness and horror. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Reed lost his wife to illness, but he'd already lost himself to hatred. He spent 15 years maintaining the very hall where his wife had been humiliated, perhaps as a form of penance, perhaps as a way of keeping the wound fresh. When he learned Patricia Hammond would return, he saw it as an opportunity. But opportunities for revenge are really just opportunities for self-destruction. What will happen to us? Dr. Hayes asked. Legally, Miss Marple said, that's for the courts to decide. Both of you will certainly face serious charges. The fact that you each attempted murder independently doesn't diminish either of your guilt. Your poison appears to have been the fatal dose, given the concentration and Patricia's rapid death. So you may face a murder conviction while Mr. Reed faces attempted murder. And morally? Morally, Miss Marple said quietly, you'll carry this for the rest of your lives. You've taken a life, violated the core principle of your profession, and risked the lives of innocent people. No legal punishment can be heavier than that knowledge. After leaving the jail, Miss Marple stopped by the village hall, where preparations were underway for the Christmas Eve service. Dorothy Mills was directing the placement of evergreen boughs with her usual efficiency, though she looked careworn and sad. Miss Marple, Dorothy said, setting down her clipboard, I've been meaning to ask, should we cancel the Christmas pudding competition permanently? It seems tainted now, associated with such horror. Miss Marple considered this, carefully. I don't think you should cancel it. The competition itself isn't to blame for what happened. It was simply the stage where two troubled people acted on their worst impulses. The tradition of community baking, of shared celebration, of friendly competition, those things are still valuable. But how can anyone enjoy it again, knowing what happened? The same way we enjoy anything after tragedy, Miss Marple said, by remembering that human beings are complex, capable of both great good and terrible evil, by choosing to emphasize the good while remaining vigilant against the evil. The Christmas pudding competition brought joy to St. Mary Mead for decades before this tragedy. It can do so again if we don't let the actions of two people destroy what generations built. Dorothy nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right. though I think we'll need better security measures for the kitchen." "That would be wise," Miss Marple agreed with a slight smile. As she walked home through the December evening, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Two intelligent, respected members of the community had independently decided that murder was justified. Both had perverted their professional knowledge, Dr. Hayes's medical expertise, and Mr. Reed's access to chemicals for pest control, to commit violence. Patricia Hammond had been a genuinely terrible person, cruel and corrupt and destructive. But her victims had become terrible in their own ways, allowing justified anger to transform into murderous intent. The Christmas pudding, symbol of abundance and celebration and family tradition, had become a delivery mechanism for poison. The communal kitchen, meant to foster cooperation and equality, had become a crime scene, yet Miss Marple had faith that St. Mary Mead would recover, as communities always did. The essential decency of most people would reassert itself. The traditions would continue, perhaps modified but not destroyed. And the lesson, painful but necessary, would be remembered, that seeking vengeance, however justified the original grievance, only created more victims and more tragedy. Chapter 10. Justice and Healing. The trial of Dr. Sarah Hayes and Thomas Reed took place the following spring, after months of legal manoeuvring and forensic analysis. Miss Marple attended several days of testimony, finding the proceedings both fascinating and deeply sad. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent. Dr. Hayes's detailed plan, found in her desk, showed methodical preparation over months. Thomas Reed's online purchase of sodium cyanide, his early arrival at the hall on the day of the competition, his hasty poisoning of 14 containers, all demonstrated clear intent to kill. The defense attorneys argued that Patricia Hammond's decades of cruelty and professional misconduct constituted extreme provocation. They presented testimony from numerous victims of Hammond's reviews and blackmail schemes, painting a picture of a woman whose actions had destroyed lives and livelihoods without remorse. Miss Marple listened to these arguments with mixed feelings. Patricia Hammond had indeed been cruel and corrupt, but cruelty and corruption, however egregious, did not justify murder. The forensic evidence ultimately determined the legal outcomes. Analysis conclusively showed that the poison in entry number 8, Dr. Hayes's container, had been the fatal dose. The concentration was higher, the mixing more thorough, and the timing of Patricia Hammond's symptoms corresponded precisely with her consumption of that specific brandy butter. Therefore, Dr. Hayes was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 12 years given the provocation and her previously exemplary character. Thomas Reed was convicted of 14 counts of attempted murder, one for each container he'd poisoned. The judge noted that while Reed's poison hadn't directly killed Patricia Hammond, it had created a lethal situation that could easily have resulted in multiple deaths. He was sentenced to 15 years, with possibility of parole after 8. Both defendants accepted their sentences without appeal. During her final statement before sentencing, Dr. Hayes addressed the court with notable composure. "I want to say clearly and without reservation that what I did was wrong," she stated. "Patricia Hammond was a terrible person who hurt many people, including my mother, but I had no right to appoint myself her executioner. I betrayed my profession, my principles, and the trust of my community. I particularly want to apologize to Marcus Webb and Timothy Fletcher, the other judges, whose lives I endangered without thought or remorse. They were innocent people who could have died because of my actions. That knowledge will haunt me far more than any prison sentence." Thomas Reed's statement was briefer but equally heartfelt. "I thought killing Patricia Hammond would honor my wife's memory. Instead, I dishonored it." Elizabeth was a kind, gentle person who would have been horrified by what I did. I let grief and anger transform me into someone she wouldn't recognize. I accept my punishment and can only hope that in time I might do something to make amends. After the trial concluded, Miss Marple hosted a small tea for several people involved in the case. Dorothy Mills attended, as did Inspector Slack, Marcus Webb, and, somewhat surprisingly, Timothy Fletcher. "Do you think justice was served?" Dorothy asked as Miss Marple poured tea. "Legal justice was certainly served," Miss Marple replied. "Both Dr. Hayes and Mr. Reed were held accountable for their actions. As for moral justice, that's more complicated. Patricia Hammond escaped earthly justice for her own crimes. Her victims will carry their scars forever. Is there justice in that? She was a dreadful woman, Marcus Webb said quietly. What she did to me, demanding money under threat of a false review, that was criminal. But I'm glad. I didn't kill her. I'm glad I found a way to live with the injustice rather than compounding it with more violence. That's the lesson, isn't it? Miss Marple said. Living with injustice is hard. Accepting that bad people sometimes prosper and good people sometimes suffer, that's profoundly difficult. But responding to injustice with more injustice only creates additional suffering. Inspector Slack, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Miss Marple, you suspected something was wrong with Dr. Hayes' confession from the beginning. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Experience with human nature, Inspector. When someone confesses to a crime with absolutely no hesitation or emotion, it often suggests they're either protecting someone else or they believe they're guilty of something they didn't actually do. Dr. Hayes' confession was too complete, too detailed, almost rehearsed. She'd prepared herself to take full responsibility, perhaps hoping that would end the investigation quickly. But she didn't know about Thomas Reed's involvement, Dorothy said. No, neither of them knew about the other. They each thought they were acting alone, which created that odd situation where two separate poisoning attempts occurred simultaneously, targeting the same victim. It's extraordinarily rare. What will happen to the Christmas pudding competition? Timothy Fletcher asked. Will St. Mary Mead continue the tradition? Dorothy Mills set down her teacup with determination. Yes, we will. We've already made plans for next year. There will be changes, certainly. All accompaniments will be prepared in the communal kitchen under supervision, not brought from home. We'll have better security measures for food storage. But the tradition itself is worth preserving. I agree, Miss Marple said. Traditions bind communities together. They connect past and present, honour those who came before, and give us shared experiences that strengthen social bonds. What happened this year was tragic, but it shouldn't destroy something valuable that has brought joy for generations. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on various aspects of the case and its aftermath. When the guests finally departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, watching the spring evening deepen into night. She thought about the Christmas pudding, that rich, dark confection that took months to prepare properly. The ingredients had to be assembled carefully, mixed with intention, aged with patience. It was a dish that rewarded planning and tradition but could be destroyed by a single poisoned element. Human communities were much the same, she reflected, built over generations, strengthened by shared traditions and mutual care, but vulnerable to the poison of hatred and revenge. Dr. Hayes and Thomas Reed had each added their poison to St. Mary Mead's Christmas tradition, and the entire community had suffered. Yet communities, like traditions, were resilient. St. Mary Mead would recover. The Christmas pudding competition would continue. New memories would be made, gradually overwhelming the terrible memories of this year. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, a baby's sweater this time in soft green wool. Her needles clicked rhythmically as she worked, the simple repetitive motion soothing after the complexities of the case. The pattern was coming together nicely, each stitch building on the previous one, creating something useful and beautiful. That was how one moved forward after tragedy, she thought. One stitch at a time, one day at a time, one act of kindness or normalcy at a time. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening routines. Lights glowed in cottage windows. A cat prowled along a garden wall. The church bells rang 8 o'clock, their familiar sound carrying across the village. Life continued, as it always did. People would remember the Christmas pudding murder for years to come, retelling the story of the two poisoners and their terrible revenge. But they would also remember the lessons, that vengeance destroys those who pursue it, that hatred is its own poison, that justice and revenge are not the same thing. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that was the most important thing. Not that evil be punished, though it should be. Not that the guilty be caught, though they must be. But that communities learn from tragedy, that individuals choose wisdom over vengeance, that life's complex patterns continue despite the inevitable dropped stitches and tangled threads. Her needles continued their steady rhythm as darkness fell completely. Another case solved, another lesson learned, another reminder that human nature, in all its complexity, remained endlessly fascinating and eternally challenging. The Christmas pudding murder was over, but life in St. Mary Mead went on. The end.